She signed her life away to save her brother. But the devil she made a deal with turned out to be the only person who ever truly saw her. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. If you're already hooked after the first 60 seconds, stay until the end, because what happens between Charlotte Whitmore and Damian Moretti is not the kind of story you walk away from clean. Follow the channel so you don't miss a single part. This one is going to hurt before it heals. The rain came down like it was trying to erase something. Charlotte Whitmore sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by 3 open laptops, 2 energy drink cans, and a stack of client invoices she hadn't touched in 4 days. Her hair was pulled into a knot so tight it gave her a headache she'd stopped noticing. The overhead light had been flickering since Tuesday. She hadn't called the landlord because calling the landlord meant a conversation, and conversations took time she didn't have. She was 23 years old and already exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The cybersecurity contract on her center screen was 3 hours from deadline. A mid-sized logistics firm in Ohio needed their network vulnerability assessment completed by midnight, and she was 80% through it, and she would finish it because she always finished, because finishing was the only thing standing between her and the eviction notice taped to the inside of her kitchen cabinet, the one she'd moved there so she wouldn't have to see it every time she walked in the door. 14 days, that's what the notice said. 14 days to produce 2 months of back rent or vacate the premises. She typed faster. The apartment around her was small and worn in the specific way that came from years of being occupied by people who never had quite enough. The carpet was the color of old mustard. The window above the fire escape had a crack sealed with packing tape that she'd meant to replace with actual weather stripping since February. The radiator knocked and hissed in the corner like a bad-tempered animal. She'd learned to sleep through it. What she hadn't learned to sleep through was the sound of her phone buzzing with notifications she was afraid to open. Ethan had sent 7 messages in the last 2 hours. She hadn't read any of them. Her older brother's name on her screen produced a specific physical sensation somewhere between her sternum and her stomach. A clenching, a bracing, the way your body tightens before something hits you. She loved Ethan the way you love someone who has cost you everything and keeps costing you more. She loved him, and she was furious at him, and she was scared for him, and she was tired of all 3 feelings existing in her simultaneously without any of them ever resolving. I was 31 years old. He had their father's jaw and their mother's stubborn streak and an addiction to risk that had destroyed every good thing that had ever come within arm's reach of him. Poker first, then sports betting, then crypto schemes with names that sounded legitimate until you looked at them for more than 30 seconds. He'd lost their mother's insurance payout 18 months ago, $40,000, chasing a coin that collapsed 3 weeks after he put everything into it. She hadn't spoken to him for 6 weeks after that. Then he'd shown up at her door with a split lip and blood on his shirt collar, and she'd let him in because she always let him in, because he was her brother and there was no one else. She finished the Ohio contract at 11:47, submitted it, sent the invoice, closed the laptop. The rain outside intensified. She was reaching for the nearest energy drink when the knock came at her front door. Not a knock exactly, more of an impact. 3 heavy blows that rattled the frame in a way that a human fist shouldn't have been able to accomplish. The kind of knock that wasn't asking permission. Charlotte went still. She lived on the 4th floor of a building with a buzzer system that technically required someone to let you in from the street. Technically. The buzzer had been broken for 11 months, which meant anyone could walk in off the street and climb the stairs, which was something she tried not to think about when she was working alone at midnight. She wasn't thinking about it theoretically anymore. She got to her feet slowly, leaving her phone on the floor, and moved toward the door with the particular quiet that came from not wanting whoever was on the other side to know exactly where she was. She made it to the peephole. 3 men in the hallway. The one in front was tall. Not just tall, but constructed, the way certain men are constructed, like the body was assembled with specific purpose rather than grown. Dark suit. No tie. His hands were at his sides and completely still, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd been moving. His face was angular, sharp-edged, with cold blue eyes that even through the distortion of the peephole looked like they were doing math, calculating distance, calculating weight, calculating exactly how long this interaction was going to take. The 2 men behind him were larger and had the particular blankness of people who had been hired specifically for their size and their willingness to use it. Charlotte's hand found the deadbolt. Miss Whitmore. The voice came through the door like it didn't need an invitation. Low and controlled and absolutely certain she was standing right there. My name is Damian Moretti. I'm here about your brother. She didn't move. I'd prefer to have this conversation indoors, he said. But I'm patient. The thing about that sentence was the specific way he said patient. Not like it was a virtue, but like it was a warning. Like patience for him was simply the interval between deciding to do something and doing it. Charlotte looked around her apartment. Laptops. Invoices. A kitchen knife and a block on the counter 12 feet away. She unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door. Damian Moretti walked in like he'd been in the apartment before. Not hurrying, not looking around with the curiosity of someone entering a new space, just moving through it with the ease of a man who considered most spaces his by default. His two associates stopped at the threshold. He didn't invite them in, and they didn't follow. That, somehow, was worse than if they'd all three entered together. He looked at the laptops. The energy drink cans. The eviction notice she'd stupidly left on the counter instead of putting it back in the cabinet. You've been working, he said. It's late. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. What do you want? It wasn't a question. She didn't have the bandwidth to make it a question. He turned to face her fully. Up close, Damian Moretti was the kind of person who made you aware of the precise dimensions of whatever room you were sharing with him. Not because he was loud or aggressive, he wasn't, not exactly, but because there was a density to his presence that displaced something. Air, maybe. Certainty. The comfortable assumption that you were in control of your own space. Your brother owes me $3 million, he said. The number landed in Charlotte's chest like a physical object. 3. She stopped. Restarted. That's not possible. It's very possible. He said it without heat. He borrowed $2 million 8 months ago at terms he agreed to in writing. The remaining $200,000 is interest. He's been making partial payments and then disappearing. The last payment was 4 months ago. I've been extending courtesy that I don't typically extend. Courtesy? She repeated. Yes. You showed up at my apartment at midnight with 2 men in the hallway, and you're calling it courtesy. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, something more measured than that. The 2 men are in the hallway. I'm in your apartment having a conversation. There's a meaningful difference. Charlotte's hands were shaking. She put them behind her back so he couldn't see it. Where is Ethan? I was hoping you could tell me. She stared at him. What? I was due at a meeting 3 days ago. He didn't appear. He's not at any address I have for him. His phone goes to voicemail. Damian tilted his head slightly. You're his emergency contact. He's not here. I know. I would have found him already if he was. He paused. When did you last speak with him? I don't... She pressed her fingers against her sternum, trying to push back the rising panic. 7 unread messages. She hadn't read them. She'd seen his name and she'd decided she didn't have the capacity tonight, and she'd left them sitting there. I haven't read his messages. He sent some tonight. I haven't... She moved to her phone before she finished the sentence, crouching down on the floor and opening the thread with hands that were no longer pretending to be steady. The first 4 messages were Ethan being Ethan. Chatty, deflecting, sending her a meme, asking if she'd eaten, the kind of messages he sent when he was trying to seem normal. The 5th message, sent at 9:17, was different. Charlie, I need you to know I love you, and I'm sorry for everything. I mean all of it. I'm sorry. The 6th, don't try to find me okay, just let it be. The 7th, sent at 10:49. If anyone comes looking, just tell them you don't know anything because you don't. Stay out of it, please. The floor felt less stable than it had 60 seconds ago. She looked up at Damian Moretti, who was watching her read with an expression that gave nothing away. He ran, she said. Yes. He borrowed $3 million from you and then he ran. That appears to be the situation. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt wrong. Not weak exactly, but uncertain, like her body was recalibrating. So what happens now? You can't collect from someone who isn't here. No, Damian agreed. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, a gesture that looked almost casual, except that nothing about this man was casual. Which is why I'm here. The specific quality of his silence after that sentence told her exactly what was coming before he said it. I'm giving you 72 hours to produce your brother, or the equivalent value. If neither condition is met... He paused, and the pause was deliberate, shaped. The debt transfers. Transfers, she said flatly, to me. You're listed as his emergency contact. You share a financial history. The documentation supports it. I'm 23 years old. I'm a cybersecurity student with 3 freelance contracts. I don't have $3 million. I'm aware. Then you know the debt transferring to me is completely meaningless. Not entirely. He reached into his jacket. The 2 men in the hallway shifted slightly, she noticed, tracking the movement by instinct, and produced a single white card. He set it on her kitchen counter, next to the eviction notice. I have uses for someone with your skill set. If Ethan doesn't surface in 72 hours, we'll discuss alternative arrangements. He walked back toward the door. You can't just... She hated how her voice cracked on it. Hated it. You can't come in here and tell me I'm responsible for what my brother did. I didn't borrow anything from you. I don't have anything to do with this. Damien stopped with his hand on the door frame. He turned back and his expression had shifted. Not softened, exactly, but something in it had opened slightly, the way a shutter opens to let in more light before closing again. No, he said. You don't. That's the part that's unfortunate. Then he left. The 2 men in the hallway followed without looking at her. She heard their footsteps descend the stairs, unhurried and even, and then the distant protest of the building's front door. Charlotte stood in her apartment for a long time without moving. The rain kept coming down. She picked up Ethan's messages and read them again. Then she called his number, voicemail, first ring, which meant his phone was off or destroyed. She called twice more. Same result. She sent a text that said, call me right now, and watched the screen for 5 minutes. Nothing delivered. She sat down on the kitchen floor because the kitchen floor was closer than the couch. $3 million. 2 months of back rent was going to break her. $3 million was a number that lived in a different universe entirely. A universe she had never been anywhere near. A universe that apparently her brother had stumbled into with the same reckless confidence he brought to every disaster of his life. She thought about their mother, who had worked double shifts at a hospital for 20 years and never once complained about it, and who had died leaving $40,000 that Ethan had burned in 3 weeks. She thought about the summer she was 16 and Ethan was 24, and he'd come home from Vegas owing money to people who'd sent someone to their house. And their mother had opened the door and talked to the man on the porch with a composure that Charlotte hadn't understood until she was older. Their mother had paid that debt, every cent of it. Out of savings she'd spent a decade building. Charlotte had watched her do it without asking for anything in return. And now their mother was dead, and Ethan had done it again, except the scale had grown from thousands to millions, and the man collecting the debt wore a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and looked at her like she was a variable in an equation he was already solving. She got up, made coffee, pulled the nearest laptop toward her and opened a browser. Damien Moretti. The search results were simultaneously abundant and useless. There were real estate transactions, corporate filings, a few photographs from charity events that showed a man in a room full of powerful people looking like he belonged there more than any of them. Nothing illegal, nothing confirmed. The kind of digital footprint that had been deliberately cleaned, not the absence of information, but the presence of specifically chosen information, which was much harder to fake and much more expensive to maintain. I was real. He was serious. And he had found her apartment in the middle of the night inside of 24 hours after her brother went silent, which meant his intelligence operation was either very good or very well funded, and given everything else about him, probably both. 72 hours. She spent the first 24 of them trying to find Ethan. She called every number in her contacts who had ever known him. She drove to 3 addresses she had for him and found empty rooms, landlords who shrugged, a roommate who said Ethan had packed a single bag 2 nights ago and left without a word. She filed a missing persons report with the police and watched the officer's face go carefully neutral when she mentioned the debt, because the officer understood things about that kind of debt that he wasn't going to say out loud in a report. She came home at 2 in the morning of the second day and sat in the dark for a while. Then she picked up Damien Moretti's card and turned it over in her fingers. No title, just a phone number. The cardstock was heavy, the kind that cost real money, the kind chosen to communicate without stating anything directly. She didn't call. Not yet. She put the card back on the counter and went to sleep on her couch with her phone in her hand. The second day yielded nothing. Ethan was gone in the comprehensive, deliberate way that people who are running from serious consequences learn to disappear. No cards used. No phone signal. No sightings from anyone who had ever known him. It was almost impressive, except that it was her brother, and the disappearance was going to land directly on her. On the morning of the third day, she woke up to the sound of someone knocking on her door again. This time, she didn't go to the peephole. She already knew. She opened the door, and Damien Moretti stood in the hallway alone. No associates this time, which felt like a different kind of statement. And he looked at her face for exactly 2 seconds before he said, "You didn't find him." "No." He nodded once, like he'd expected this. "Come in," she said, because there was no point in making him ask. He came in. She'd cleaned the apartment in the last 3 days out of some instinct she didn't fully understand, some refusal to have this conversation, surrounded by evidence of her exhaustion. The laptops were closed, the invoices were filed, the energy drink cans were gone. She'd even fixed the packing tape on the window, because if she was going to negotiate with the devil, she was going to do it in a space that looked like she had some control over her life. She stood by the counter. He stood by the door. The distance between them was precise and deliberate on both sides. "The 72 hours are up," she said. "Yes." "You said we'd discuss alternative arrangements." "Yes." She crossed her arms over her chest, not because she was cold, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "Tell me what that means." Damien looked at her for a moment, not the calculating look from the first night, but something more considered, like he was making a final decision he'd already made and was confirming it one last time. "Your brother's debt doesn't disappear because he disappeared," he said, "but I'm a practical man. I don't pursue things that can't yield results. Hunting Ethan Whitmore across whatever city he's hiding in costs resources and time for a return that isn't guaranteed." He paused. "You're a different calculation." "I'm not a calculation, Miss Whitmore." His voice was even, not unkind. "Everything is a calculation. You, specifically, are a very interesting one. You have a skill set that took me 3 hours to verify, and that I've been looking to acquire for approximately 8 months. You're self-taught in areas that most professionals with twice your experience don't understand. Your freelance client list includes 2 Fortune 500 firms who pay you significantly below your value because you haven't figured out yet that you can charge more." She stared at him. "I'm offering you a position," he said, "full-time, exclusive. You'd manage the digital security infrastructure of my organization. In exchange, your brother's debt is suspended, not forgiven, suspended, and you receive a salary, housing, and protection." "Protection," she repeated. "My enemies are real. If they discover that Ethan Whitmore is my outstanding debtor and that his sister is findable, they'll look for leverage. I prefer to make that leverage disappear. By bringing me into your organization. By bringing you somewhere I can control the variables." Charlotte uncrossed her arms and pressed both palms flat on the counter behind her. The laminate was cool and slightly uneven under her fingers. She focused on the texture of it. "What you're describing is imprisonment. What I'm describing is employment. With the implicit understanding that I can't leave." I was quiet for a moment. "You can always leave. The question is what leaving would cost." "Which is what, exactly?" "Ethan's debt becomes immediately collectible, and I stop being interested in his continued well-being." There it was, clean and direct, which she almost respected more than if he'd dressed it up. At least he wasn't pretending. At least he was giving her the actual terms instead of packaging them in language designed to make her feel better about having no real choice. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away, and in that sustained eye contact was a negotiation that had nothing to do with words. 2 people taking each other's measure, deciding how much of what they were seeing was accurate. "How long?" she asked. "Indefinite. Contingent on performance and behavior." "And my brother?" "Alive. Hidden. Not my problem unless he makes himself my problem." "He's already your problem." "I was. Now he's your problem and I'm your employer." A pause. "Those are different things." Charlotte looked down at the counter, at her hands. At the eviction notice she'd moved back to its visible position because at some point in the last 72 hours she'd stopped caring who saw it. She thought about Ethan's 7th message. "Stay out of it, please." He'd run. He'd left her here to absorb the consequence of something she had no part in creating, something she'd had no knowledge of, something he'd built out of his own weakness and his own desperate optimism and his own inability to stop. He'd run, and he'd put her name in the slot labeled emergency contact, as if that was something he had the right to do. as if her name in that slot meant he could take the catastrophe he'd made and simply redirect it toward her address and then disappear. I'm sorry for everything. I mean all of it. She knew he meant it. That was the thing about Ethan. He always meant it after. The remorse was real, and it didn't change a single thing. If I say no, she said, then this conversation ends. The debt transfers to you on paper, and within 60 days you're in a legal situation that will take everything you have and several things you don't. And Ethan, I'll find him eventually. I always do. She believed him. She believed him completely, not because he was threatening, but because he said it with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact about the weather. Charlotte Whitmore stood in her 1,100-square-foot apartment with the flickering light and the cracked window and the eviction notice on the counter and looked at the man who had just offered to solve her immediate problems by absorbing her entirely, and she said, I need 2 hours. You have one, Damien said. She took 40 minutes. She packed 2 bags, one with her laptops and equipment, one with clothes. She called her one close friend, a woman named Priya, who was doing her doctorate in computer science at Georgetown, and left a voicemail saying she was going to be unreachable for a while and not to worry, which Priya would absolutely interpret as a reason to worry, but there was nothing to be done about that. She looked around the apartment, at the carpet and the radiator and the packing tape, and the 4 years of solitary grinding that had added up to exactly this, exactly here, a life constructed entirely around holding the floor under her feet. She picked up her bags. Damien was standing in the hallway, patient as advertised, looking at his phone with the focus of someone who had 17 things happening simultaneously and was managing all of them. I have conditions, she said. He looked up, put his phone away. I want access to my personal accounts. I want the ability to communicate with people who know me. I want to know where my brother is. Not necessarily access to him, just proof that he's alive. He considered each item with the focus of someone who didn't agree or disagree until he'd fully processed. The accounts? Yes. Communication? Yes, within reason. Your brother, he paused. Periodic confirmation. Not location. Confirmation. Every week. Every 2 weeks. She wanted to push back. She didn't. Fine. Anything else? If I find evidence that your organization is doing something that would get me arrested, I reserve the right to renegotiate. A muscle moved in his jaw. You're in no position to reserve rights. I'm in the position of being the person you need enough to show up personally, she said, which means I have exactly one piece of leverage and I'm using it now before I get in whatever car is waiting downstairs and lose the ability to use it at all. The silence stretched. Then Damien said, noted, which was not an agreement. But it was also not a refusal. And she understood, standing there in the hallway of her failing apartment with her 2 bags and her stolen 40 minutes, that noted from this man meant something. That he didn't say things he didn't intend. She followed him down the stairs and out the front door into the rain. A black car waited at the curb. Not ostentatious, just solid and dark and capable, like everything else about him. The driver got out to take her bags without being asked. Charlotte stood on the wet sidewalk and looked up at the window of her apartment, the 4th floor, the cracked glass, the packing tape she'd replaced 40 minutes ago out of some last stubborn act of maintenance. She thought about her mother, about Ethan, about the $40,000 and the split lip and every time she'd opened a door for someone who was going to cost her something. She got in the car. The city moved past the windows, rain-blurred and indifferent, and Damien sat across from her with his hands folded and his eyes forward, and the particular stillness of a man who had already moved on to whatever came next. Charlotte looked at her reflection in the rain-streaked glass. The city disappeared behind them. She had no way of knowing. Not then, not in that car, not with the rain coming down and her brother gone and her life packed into 2 bags. That the estate she was being driven to held more than the prison she was preparing herself for. She had no way of knowing that somewhere inside those walls, a secret had been waiting for her since before Damien Moretti had ever knocked on her door. She had no way of knowing that Ethan wasn't as gone as she believed. But she would find out, and when she did, everything she thought she understood about Damien Moretti, about loyalty, about what a person was capable of when they finally stopped running from themselves, all of it was going to break apart and reassemble into something she never could have predicted from the backseat of a black car on a rainy night, leaving behind an apartment she'd already stopped thinking of as home. The estate materialized out of the darkness, the way things do when they've been designed to impress. Slowly, in pieces, each piece more deliberate than the last. First the gate, Iron, tall, set into a stone wall that ran further in both directions than Charlotte could track from the car window. Then the driveway lined with trees that had been planted close enough together that their canopies formed a tunnel, and in the rain and the dark the tunnel felt less like landscaping and more like a throat swallowing her. Then the house itself, which was not a house, was never going to be accurately called a house, but a structure of pale stone and tall windows, and a facade that communicated wealth the way certain people communicated authority, without raising its voice. Charlotte counted 3 visible security cameras before the car stopped. She stopped counting after that because the number stopped mattering. The driver opened her door. She got out into the rain and stood on the wet stone steps and looked up at the entrance and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, absolutely nothing. Not fear, not awe, not the particular species of despair she'd been bracing for. Just a flat, gray steadiness. The same feeling she got when she was 3 hours into a complex network assessment and had moved past the anxiety into pure function. She was going to treat this like a problem. Problems had solutions. She was good at solutions. Damien came around the car and moved past her up the steps without pausing, like her presence beside him was already an established fact that required no acknowledgement. "Marcus will show you to your room," he said. "There'll be a briefing in the morning." "What time?" 7. "I need my equipment set up before then." He stopped at the top step and turned back. The rain had darkened his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "We have equipment." "I use my own." A beat. "Fine. Marcus will help you with that." Then he went inside, and the door closed behind him, and Charlotte was left on the steps with her 2 bags in the rain, and a man who had materialized at her elbow. Marcus, apparently, who was somewhere in his mid-40s, built square and solid, with the kind of face that had seen considerable amounts of difficult weather and stopped being surprised by any of it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not unkindly. "Charlotte," she said. He picked up both her bags before she could object. "This way." Her room was on the 2nd floor, east wing, and it was larger than her entire apartment. She didn't let herself react to that. The bed was made with the precision of someone who had been trained to do it and took the training seriously. There was a desk by the window, a real desk, solid wood, with enough surface area to run all 3 laptops simultaneously. She noted this. She unpacked her equipment first before her clothes and had everything running and connected by 2 in the morning. She didn't sleep. She sat at the desk and mapped the estate's Wi-Fi architecture for 3 hours, not because anyone had asked her to, but because understanding the network was the closest thing to understanding the space, and understanding the space was the closest thing to feeling like she had any footing here at all. The network was good. Better than good, actually. Layered in a way that showed someone with real knowledge had designed it, not a contractor hired to install a standard package. She found 2 redundant security channels, a guest network that was completely isolated from the main infrastructure, and a 3rd network that was encrypted at a level that told her exactly nothing about what it carried, which told her everything about why it existed. She wrote 3 pages of notes and went to sleep at 4:30. Damien's briefing at 7 was not what she expected. She'd expected a conference room, other people, an organizational chart of some kind. Instead, it was just the 2 of them in a room off the main hallway. Not an office exactly, more like a room that had been adapted into one, with bookshelves that held actual books, and a table that held actual paper, and Damien standing at the window with a coffee cup looking like he'd been awake for hours already, which he probably had. He turned when she came in. She'd put on clean clothes and pulled her hair back and washed her face, and she was running on 2 hours of sleep, but she walked in straight, and she sat down without being invited, and she put her notebook on the table and uncapped her pen. He watched her do all of this. "You mapped the network last night," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. "Yes." "Find anything interesting?" "The 3rd channel is military-grade encrypted. That's either very impressive or very concerning." "Both," he said, sitting across from her. "Depends on your perspective." "What does it carry?" "Communication between myself and 2 other principals. Nothing you need access to at this stage." "At this stage." She wrote that down. The briefing lasted 90 minutes. He walked her through the organization's digital infrastructure with a directness she hadn't anticipated. Not everything, not the 3rd channel, not the full scope of whatever the operation actually was at its core, but the architecture of it, the shape of it, the specific vulnerabilities he'd been aware of and hadn't yet addressed. 3 weeks ago, someone had probed the outer layer of their financial transaction network. 6 weeks before that, a phishing attempt targeting two of his senior people, sophisticated enough that one of them had nearly clicked through before catching himself. Someone's been testing your perimeter, Charlotte said. Yes. Consistently, not randomly. These aren't opportunistic attacks. She looked at her notes. This is someone building a picture. That's my read. Do you know who? I have a theory. He said it in a way that indicated the theory was well developed and that he wasn't sharing it yet. She looked up from her notebook. You're asking me to defend a house I'm not allowed to fully see. I'm asking you to defend the parts you can see while I determine how much of the rest I can show you. That's inefficient. It's also how it works. For now. Charlotte held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her notes. She could push. She could make an argument about why full access was operationally necessary, which it was, and she could make it well. But she'd been here less than 12 hours and she had essentially no leverage, and the calculation was clear. Work with what she had, demonstrate value, acquire access incrementally. It was the same way she'd built every professional relationship she'd ever had. She said, I'll need the logs from the last 6 months. Marcus will get them for you. And direct access to your IT person. That's Felix. He'll be resistant. Everyone's resistant until they're not. Something shifted at the corner of Damien's mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained. He's been running this system for 3 years. He considers it his. That's fine. I don't want his system. I want to see his documentation. You think his documentation is the problem? I think undocumented decisions are always where the vulnerabilities live. She paused. Whoever built the network was good, but good people make undocumented decisions when they think they're the only one who'll ever look at the thing. Damien set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with the direct measuring quality that she was starting to understand was not aggression, but assessment. The way an engineer looks at a bridge, they're deciding whether to trust with weight. You're better than I was told, he said. You were told by someone who looked at my client list. Yes. My client list is the work I could find. It's not the ceiling. He nodded once. I know that now. She left the meeting with 6 months of network logs on an encrypted drive and the particular tight feeling behind her sternum that came from being in a situation she didn't control and having to be excellent anyway. Felix was exactly as resistant as advertised. I was 28, wiry, with the specific aggressive confidence of someone who had been the smartest person in most rooms he'd entered and had built his entire identity on that foundation. He met her in the server room on the basement level at 10 in the morning, and he shook her hand with the energy of a man preparing to be unimpressed. Damien said you want my documentation, he said. Please. The system's fine. I'm sure it is. I still want the documentation. He crossed his arms. I've been running this network for 3 years without an incident. There have been 2 attempted penetrations in the last 6 weeks. His jaw tightened. Attempted. Neither was successful. That you know of. She said it without heat, which was deliberate. Successful intrusions don't always announce themselves. That's rather the point. The silence in the server room was filled with the low hum of cooling systems and the specific quality of a man deciding whether to fight or tolerate. The documentation is organized by quarter, he said finally. It'll take me an hour to pull it. I'll wait. She spent the hour examining the physical infrastructure, which told her things that the network logs didn't. Cable management that had been meticulous for the first 2 years and progressively less careful after that. The kind of entropy that happened when a system grew faster than the person managing it could keep up with. 3 servers added in the last 8 months that weren't on any diagram she'd been given. When Felix came back with the documentation, she pointed at the 3 servers immediately. Those aren't in the architecture diagram. He looked at them, then at her. They were added for the East Wing expansion. The diagram's it hasn't been updated. When was the last time the diagram was updated? A pause that was slightly too long. 8 months ago. So the diagram is 8 months out of date, and you have undocumented servers running on the main network. They're isolated. Are they? He opened his mouth, closed it. Charlotte pulled out her laptop. Let's find out. They were not isolated. One of them was running a process that she couldn't immediately identify, and when she traced the process, it connected to an external IP address that was being routed through 3 anonymizing layers, which was either something Felix had set up deliberately for a legitimate reason or something that had been placed there without his knowledge. And neither option was good. Felix stood beside her and his arms uncrossed, and his entire defensive posture collapsed into something that looked a lot like fear. "I didn't set that up," he said. "I know. I mean, I genuinely, that's not something I—" "Felix!" She kept her voice even. "When did you install this server?" 7 months ago. It was for the backup expansion. I set it up from a vendor image, standard deployment. Where did the vendor image come from? He told her. She wrote it down. She didn't tell him what she suspected because she didn't have confirmation yet, but the shape of what she was looking at was starting to cohere into something that had a specific name. A long game intrusion, patient and careful, planted months ago and sitting dormant until whoever planted it decided to use it. She spent 4 hours in the server room. When she came out, she went directly to Damien. I was in his office, the real one, on the ground floor, which she'd been shown the location of but not yet entered. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in and closed the door behind her and stood in front of his desk and said, "Someone has been inside your network for 7 months." Damien set down his pen. "Not actively accessing it," she said. "Watching, building a map, waiting." She put her notes on his desk. It was planted through a compromised vendor image in a server that Felix deployed without adequate vetting. That's not Felix's fault. The image passed standard checksum verification, which means whoever did this had the resources to produce a convincing fake. This is not an amateur operation. He looked at her notes, then at her. "Can you remove it? I already quarantined it, but removing it needs to be done carefully, or we alert whoever is watching that we found it. You want to leave it in place? I want to use it. Feed it controlled information, see what they do with it." She paused. "But that requires you to decide how much risk you're comfortable with, because it also means leaving an open channel in your network for however long the operation takes." He leaned back in his chair. Outside the window behind him, the rain had finally stopped, and the light coming through was pale and thin. "How long would you need?" he said. 2 weeks minimum, possibly 4. And during that time, whatever intelligence I feed through that channel, they see. "Yes. So it has to be real enough to be credible and false enough not to actually damage you." I was quiet for a long time. She let the quiet be. She'd learned in the first 12 hours that Damien Moretti's silences were not empty. They were the sound of someone doing serious calculation, and interrupting them was not something she intended to do. "Do it," he said finally. "I'll need full access to the network." Another pause, shorter this time. "You'll have it by end of day." She turned to leave. "Charlotte?" She stopped. He almost never used her first name. He'd used it once, she thought, possibly twice. Hearing it now in that office, in that voice, had a specific texture she wasn't prepared to examine. "Good work," he said. She left without answering, because the answer that came to mind, "I know," seemed either too cold or too something else, and she didn't have time to figure out which. The weeks that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. She worked long hours, which she'd always done, but here the work had a different weight to it. Not the grinding quality of freelance contracts and client management, but something more like being inside a problem too large to see all of from any one position, which required constant movement, constant reorientation, constant adjustment. She was good at it. She knew she was good at it. The knowing had a different quality here, though, not the quiet private satisfaction of submitting a clean assessment to an Ohio logistics firm, but the sharper thing that came from working at the edge of her actual capability with real stakes attached. She didn't trust Damien. That was important to be clear about. She didn't trust him, and she didn't pretend to, and she thought he understood that and respected it, in the particular way that people who are themselves suspicious of most things respect it in others. But she watched him. She watched how he ran the operation, the evenness of him, the precision, the way he dealt with the people around him with a directness that could be cold but was never dishonest. She watched him keep his word on the small things, and then the medium things, and she took note. The note didn't mean trust, but it meant something. She got her first confirmation about Ethan at the end of the second week. A single message through Marcus, E. Whitmore, confirmed alive. Location undisclosed. She read it 3 times in the privacy of her room and then put her phone face down on the desk and sat with the feeling that came with it, which was not relief exactly. Relief would have been clean, and this was not clean. It was relief mixed with something that tasted like resentment, and underneath the resentment was the grief of someone who had finally, after years of careful avoidance, started to understand that the person she'd been sacrificing things for might not be worth the sacrifice. She didn't cry about it. She went back to work. The controlled information operation she'd set up through the compromised server began producing results in the third week. Whoever was on the other end started incorporating her planted data into observable patterns. She could see it in the way the external probing shifted, repositioning itself based on the false architecture she'd fed them. They were smart. They were patient. They were wrong about almost everything they thought they knew about Damien's operation because she'd been feeding them a picture built to look exactly right from the outside and be fundamentally misleading from the inside. She told Damien on a Tuesday evening. She'd knocked on his office door and found him on a call, and he'd held up a hand and finished the call while she stood by the window and looked at the grounds below. The garden that was too geometric to be natural, the perimeter lights coming on in the dusk, two of his security people doing their rotation. When he finished the call, he said, "Tell me," she told him. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without performing engagement, just actually receiving information. When she finished, he asked 3 questions, precise and specific, that showed he'd understood exactly what she was describing. "They're going to move in the next 10 days, she said. "Whatever they're planning, the data I fed them will push them toward it. They think they have a window." "What kind of move?" I don't know yet, but the probing pattern shifted from infrastructure to personnel in the last 72 hours. They're looking at people now, not systems. Damien was still. "That means they're past the planning stage," she said. "They're in targeting." He stood up from his desk and went to the window beside her. He stood close enough that she could see the reflection of both their faces in the glass, overlapping slightly in the dusk light. "Do you know who it is yet?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She looked at his reflection. "Are you going to tell me?" "Not yet." She wanted to push back on that. She didn't. Instead, she said, "Then I need you to tell me one thing." He turned slightly toward her. The space between them was maybe 2 feet, which was closer than they usually stood, and neither of them moved to increase the distance. "What is it?" he said. "Whatever is about to happen, whatever this attack is, and whoever is behind it, am I in the room when it goes down, or am I in a hallway waiting to be told what happened?" He looked at her. In the reflection, she saw something move across his face. Not calculation this time. Not the engineering assessment qualities she'd learned to read. Something more like decision. "You're in the room," he said. She nodded. "Okay. You should know," he said, and his voice had shifted into a register she hadn't heard from him before, lower and more careful. "That being in the room carries costs. I know that. You've been here 3 weeks. I know how long I've been here. That's not—" He stopped, looked back out the window. "Some of what you're going to learn in that room is going to be difficult to reconcile with whatever framework you're currently using to— Damien." She said his name deliberately, the way he'd used hers that first time. She felt him register it. "I stopped using comfortable frameworks when I got in your car." The silence between them was different from his calculating silences. It had a different texture, charged, slightly unsteady, like the air before a storm. Then his phone buzzed on the desk. He moved to answer it. The moment, whatever it was, closed. Charlotte stood at the window alone for a moment after he turned away. Outside, the perimeter lights were fully on now, and the grounds looked orderly and contained and completely unlike the way she felt standing there. She went back to her room. She sat at her desk and pulled up the monitoring dashboard for the compromised server and stared at the data moving across the screen. 3 weeks ago, she'd been on her kitchen floor reading her brother's goodbye messages. She was still trying to figure out what that meant, whether this place was better or worse or simply different, whether the fact that she'd stopped counting the days since she'd arrived was a sign of adaptation or something more complicated that she didn't have vocabulary for yet. Her phone buzzed. Not Marcus. Not Damien. Not any of the limited contacts she'd been allowed to maintain. The number was one she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered. "Charlie?" The voice was rougher than she remembered, strained and slightly hoarse, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "Charlie, don't hang up." Her hand tightened on the phone until her knuckles ached. "Ethan," she said, "I know I'm not supposed to— Listen, I don't have long. I just need you to hear me, okay? I need you to get out of there. Whatever he's told you, whatever arrangement you think you have, you need to— Where are you?" "That doesn't matter. Where are you, Ethan?" A pause. Then, quieter. "I can't tell you that." Damien said you're alive. That's all I know. Did he tell you? But Ethan stopped. She heard him breathing. He sounded scared in a specific way. Not the habitual anxiety of someone managing debt and consequences, but something more acute. Charlotte, there are things he hasn't told you about why he wanted you there, about what he's been building toward. He's been building toward having someone competent manage his network security. No. Emphatic. Immediate. That's not... Charlie, he knew about you before my debt, way before. He's had your name for over a year. The room went very quiet. What? She said. I was looking for someone with exactly your profile. I don't know all of it. I just know that what happened, the debt, the deadline, showing up at your apartment, some of it was real, and some of it was... Ethan's voice cut out for a second, like he'd moved or covered the phone. Some of it was engineered. Charlotte, I think you're not there because of me. I think I'm the reason he used, not the reason you're... The line went dead. Charlotte sat in the silence of her room with the phone in her hand and the monitoring dashboard running on her screen and the perimeter lights burning outside her window. Her heart was hitting her ribs at a rate that was not comfortable. She thought about the first night, about how quickly Damien had appeared after Ethan went silent, about the specific knowledge he'd had, her client list, her skill level, the assessment that she was being paid below her value. Knowledge that didn't come from reading an emergency contact form. She thought about the third network, the encrypted channel he'd refused to explain. She thought about him saying, weeks ago in his office, I've been looking to acquire your skill set for approximately 8 months. 8 months. Ethan's debt was 8 months old. She stood up from her desk slowly, the way you move when you're trying not to disturb something that might be about to break. She didn't know, yet, what was true. She didn't know how much of Ethan's claim was paranoia and how much was information. She didn't know whether the call had been Ethan being Ethan, impulsive, frightened, constructing a narrative that put him at the center of things, or whether it had been something real and specifically dangerous. But she knew one thing clearly, standing in that room with her hands cold, and her mind running very fast through every interaction she'd had with Damien Moretti since the first night. She had stopped being a captive somewhere in the last 3 weeks without noticing, and she had no idea whether that made her safer or whether it made her something much, much worse. Charlotte didn't sleep. She sat at her desk until 3 a.m. with Ethan's voice looping in her head. Some of it was engineered, and she did what she always did when something didn't add up. She worked backward from the data. Damien had said 8 months. He'd said it casually, in the context of discussing her skill set, the way you mention a timeline when you're not thinking about how it sounds. 8 months looking to acquire someone with her profile. Ethan's debt was 8 months old. The compromised vendor image in Felix's server had been planted 7 months ago, before she'd arrived, before any of this, when she was still in her apartment grinding freelance contracts and not thinking about Damien Moretti at all. She pulled up everything she had on the initial intrusion timeline, laid it next to what she knew about Ethan's borrowing history, laid that next to Damien's exact words from the first briefing. The geometry of it was uncomfortable. It didn't prove anything. Ethan was frightened and running and had spent his entire adult life constructing narratives where his choices were someone else's architecture. That was real. That was a documented pattern. He could be wrong. He could be panicking and reaching for an explanation that made the situation feel less like his own failure. But he'd known things, specific things. The word engineered was not a word Ethan Whitmore reached for naturally. At 3:15, she closed her laptops and lay on her bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and made herself think clearly about what she actually wanted to do. She could confront Damien directly. She could sit across from him and put Ethan's claim on the table and watch his face and see what happened. She was good at reading people under pressure. It was a skill she'd built out of necessity, growing up in a house where knowing when someone was lying was a survival mechanism. She could do that. Or she could find the third network. She'd been given full network access after the server room discovery. Damien had said end of day, and Marcus had delivered the credentials before dinner. She'd used the access for the compromised server operation, and she'd been careful and professional, and she hadn't pushed into the encrypted channel because there was a version of this situation where pushing into it was the wrong move, where it burned the access she'd earned and confirmed to Damien that she couldn't be trusted with the room she'd been promised. That version of the situation assumed Ethan was wrong. She got up at 4 a.m. and opened her laptop. The third network's encryption was serious, military grade, as she'd assessed in the first week. meaning someone had either purchased or stolen a significant piece of security infrastructure. She spent an hour on the outer layer and found exactly nothing, which was expected. She spent another hour on the authentication architecture and found something small, a timestamp irregularity in the handshake protocol, the kind of thing that happened when a system had been set up by someone who was excellent at security, but had copy-pasted a configuration block from an older system without updating every parameter. It was a thread. She pulled it. At 6:14 in the morning, 40 minutes before she was supposed to be functional and presentable, Charlotte Whitmore got inside the third network. What she found did not make sense immediately. It rarely did. Data in isolation looked like strings of communication logs, file transfers, encrypted attachments that she couldn't open without another layer of access she didn't have. She screenshotted everything she could reach and started reading the communication logs, which were partially decrypted at the level she'd accessed, meaning she had fragments, timestamps, sender identifiers that were coded rather than named, and pieces of message content that had survived the partial decryption. Most of it was operational, logistics, movement of money and people and materials that she deliberately didn't examine too closely because her brain was looking for one specific thing. She found it in a log from 11 months ago. The sender identifier was one she'd seen in other logs, high frequency, clearly a principal. The message fragment read, confirmed profile match, CW, Veltrum contract, Georgetown adjacent freelance, no institutional affiliation. Skill ceiling substantially higher than current positioning, recommend acquisition. Timeline, leverage event projected Q2, initiate contact post trigger. CW, Charlotte Whitmore, leverage event projected Q2. Ethan had borrowed the money in Q2. She sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the light outside her window shifted from the gray-black of pre-dawn to the thin pale gray of early morning. Long enough that she could feel her own heartbeat in a way that was separate from panic, slower and heavier, the rhythm of something settling into place. Ethan had not stumbled into Damian Moretti's orbit by accident. She didn't know yet whether that meant Ethan had been deliberately targeted, manipulated into borrowing money. He couldn't repay as a mechanism for creating a leverage event, or whether Ethan had simply been visible, a known gambler with a known risk appetite, and someone had made him an offer knowing he'd take it and knowing he'd fail. The distinction mattered morally, it mattered less practically. What mattered practically was that Damian Moretti had known about her for 11 months, had planned for her arrival, had watched Ethan construct his own disaster and had waited, patient as advertised, for the moment when that disaster would give him a legitimate reason to appear at her door. She closed her laptop and sat in the quiet for exactly 3 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to find him. I was in the kitchen, which she hadn't expected. Not his office, not the adapted room where they did briefings. The actual kitchen, standing at the counter with a coffee cup and the day's first light coming through the window behind him. He was in a white shirt without a jacket, which was the least formal she'd ever seen him, and he was looking at something on his phone when she walked in. He looked up. He saw her face. Something in his expression adjusted. Not guilt, not alarm, something more like recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and is watching it arrive now. You found the third network, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. She put her screenshots on the kitchen counter between them. Printed, because she'd stopped at the office printer on the way, because she wanted something physical, something he couldn't close or minimize or scroll past. He looked at them. He didn't touch them. CW, she said. Leverage event projected Q2. Recommend acquisition. She kept her voice flat, which cost her something. That's me. That's 11 months ago. That's 4 months before Ethan borrowed money from you. Charlotte, don't. The word came out sharp. She hadn't planned it. Don't do the thing where you use my name to slow me down. Just answer the question. He set his coffee cup down. What's the question? Did you target my brother to get to me? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something in the garden that felt obscene given the circumstances. No, Damian said. She stared at him. Ethan Whitmore approached one of my financial intermediaries independently, he said. He'd heard about the lending operation through contacts. He came to us. We didn't go to him. He paused. But once he was in our system, yes. I saw the connection. I saw his sister's name. I recognized the profile. And then you let him borrow more than he could repay. A beat. I extended terms that I knew he wouldn't meet. The coldness of that sentence, the precision of it, landed like a fist. You knew, she said. I knew the statistical likelihood. So you didn't target him. You just saw an opportunity when he handed himself to you, and you made sure the opportunity developed the way you needed it to. Yes. She picked up the screenshots and put them back in her hand and stood there and breathed. Her chest felt like something was pressing on it from the inside. Not tears. She wasn't going to cry. She hadn't cried about anything in this situation yet, and she wasn't starting now. But a pressure that needed somewhere to go and had nowhere. I was never here because of Ethan, she said. Ethan was the mechanism. You were always the point. And everything since I got here has been real, he said, and for the first time his voice had lost its evenness. Not much, barely perceptible, but she heard it. The work has been real, the access, the trust. What happened in this building over the last 3 weeks? You don't get to use the word trust right now. He closed his mouth. She looked at him. He looked back. And for a moment it was just the two of them in a kitchen with the morning coming through the window and the coffee going cold, and 3 weeks of something between them that she didn't have a clean name for. And none of it mattered at all because the foundation of it had been built on a transaction she'd never consented to. I want to know one more thing, she said. Ask. Ethan, is he here? The pause was less than a second, but it existed. Ethan is on the estate, Damien said. The kitchen tilted slightly. Not literally. Her balance was fine, but her perception of the space shifted, the walls moving a few inches in her peripheral vision. He's been here, she said slowly, since the second week. You told me he was alive. You said location undisclosed. I said undisclosed. I did not say distant. She turned away from him. She put both hands on the counter on the far side of the kitchen and gripped the edge of it and looked at the tiles on the backsplash. White, slightly uneven, handmade rather than factory produced, the kind of detail that cost money to achieve. And she breathed, in, out, in. Take me to him, she said. Ethan was in the north wing, in a room that was smaller than hers but not unkind. A single bed, a window, a desk. He was sitting on the edge of the bed when Damien opened the door, and when Charlotte walked in he stood up with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing this moment for weeks and has discovered that no amount of rehearsal prepares you. He looked worse than she expected, thinner. The circles under his eyes had the texture of something that had been there long enough to feel permanent. I was wearing clothes that weren't his, plain dark shirt, dark pants, the estate's version of house neutrals. And without his own clothes he looked strangely young, like the adult version of him had been stripped away, and what was left was the version she remembered from childhood, before everything. Charlie, he said. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then, how long have you known? He ran his hand over his face. Charlotte, how long have you known you were here while I was 30 meters away thinking you'd disappeared? Since the beginning. His voice was rough. They told me when they brought me in. They said you were here, you were working, you were fine, and that contact would, they said. She looked at Damien, who was standing in the doorway. He said. Yes, Ethan said. He said. She turned back to her brother. The anger she'd expected wasn't quite there. What was there instead was something more exhausted than anger. The feeling of a person who has been carrying weight for so long that they no longer feel it as weight, but as architecture, as the structure of themselves. And now someone has removed it, and they don't know what's underneath. You called me last night, she said. I got hold of a phone, one of the staff. I asked, He stopped. I needed you to know. You needed me to know that Damien had planned this, that you were here, that I was... She stopped herself. Why now? Why after 3 weeks? Ethan looked at his hands. His hands were shaking slightly, and she recognized that the specific tremor of someone whose nervous system had been running at crisis level for too long. Because I found out something else, he said. Something that... Charlotte, the information you've been feeding through that compromised server, the controlled operation. She went still. He's been using it, Ethan said. Not just to mislead whoever's attacking. He's been using your operation, using the false picture you built, to redirect their attention toward a specific target, someone Damien wants them to move against. She looked at Damien. His face was closed, not guilty, not ashamed, just closed, the way a door is closed, completely, with deliberate decision. Who? She said. He didn't answer. Who are you redirecting them toward? Someone who has been a problem for a significant amount of time, he said. Someone whose removal benefits the stability of this organization and three others. You used my work, she said. You let me think I was running an intelligence operation to protect your network, and the entire time you were using it to... She stopped. Thought. You're going to get someone killed. The people I've been feeding information to, the rivals. You've been steering them toward a specific person, and when they move, that person will be handled, Damien said. Yes. The word handled sat in the room. Charlotte turned away from both of them. She went to Ethan's window and looked out at the grounds. The same grounds she'd been looking at from her own window for 3 weeks. The same garden, the same lights, from a slightly different angle that made it look like a completely different place. I need you to leave, she said. Both of you. I need 5 minutes. Damien left without argument. Ethan hesitated at the door. Charlotte, 5 minutes, Ethan. He left. She stood at the window and thought with the cold precision that kicked in when everything emotional became too loud to function inside. She thought about what she'd actually done, the operation she'd designed and run, the false architecture she'd built. She'd been proud of it, genuinely, specifically proud, the kind of pride that came from clean work, from solving something hard. And every piece of it had been in service of something she hadn't consented to know about, which meant that she had been, without knowing it, the most useful tool in the room. And she hadn't even known she was a tool. She thought about what happened next. The attack Damien's enemies were preparing, the window she'd told him was 10 days, which was now 7, was coming regardless of what she did. The mechanism was already in motion. She'd built it. She'd wound the clock. She thought about leaving. She thought about what leaving looked like. Walking out of this room, finding a car, getting to a road, getting to a city, calling Priya, calling the police, telling them what? That a man in a large house was running a criminal organization, that she'd been brought here under duress and had spent 3 weeks fortifying his network and running intelligence operations and having conversations with him in the dusk light that she'd told herself were professional. She thought about what leaving would mean for Ethan. She pressed her forehead against the glass. It was cold. The cold was clarifying. She had 2 options, and they were not good options. Leave, and watch everything she'd built here be used for something she hadn't agreed to, without her ability to control what it produced. Leave Ethan in a situation she didn't fully understand. Walk out with her hands supposedly clean, and know that the clock she'd wound was still running. Or stay. Stay, and get into that room, the room Damien had promised her, and find out exactly who the target was, and what was actually being planned. Stay and decide for herself, with full information, what she was willing to be part of. Those were the options. She was 23 years old. She had 2 months of back rent and a broken window with new packing tape and a freelance client list that paid her below her value. She had a brother who had spent his entire adult life making disasters and redirecting them toward her address, and was currently sitting in the next room looking at his shaking hands. She had 3 weeks of something with Damien Moretti that she didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to examine and couldn't pretend had been nothing. She pushed back from the window. She walked out of Ethan's room. Damien was in the hallway, leaning against the opposite wall with his arms crossed, and he looked at her when she came out with the particular focused attention he gave things he considered important. The person you're steering them toward, she said. Yes. I want a name. Charlotte, a name, she said. Or I walk, right now, and you can explain to Marcus why your network is currently without the only person who can safely dismantle the operation I've been running for the last 2 weeks without triggering the other side. His jaw tightened. The muscle she'd learned to read. The one that moved when he was making a decision he'd already made and was confirming one final time. Renner, he said. Vincent Renner. He's been... I don't need the biography, she said. I need to know if he's going to be killed. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. That, Damien said, depends on the choices he makes when the pressure arrives. Charlotte looked at him and understood, with the absolute clarity of someone who had run out of comfortable interpretations, that she was no longer standing at the edge of something. She was already inside it. And Ethan's voice from the phone the night before, some of it was engineered, echoed against the walls of the hallway as she looked at the man who had built the whole architecture of the last 3 weeks around the specific shape of who she was already inside it, and the only move left was forward. Charlotte turned away from Damien without another word and walked back to her room and sat down at her desk and opened every monitoring dashboard she had running simultaneously. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about hitting a certain depth of crisis. The shaking stopped, the noise stopped, and what was left was something very cold and very clear, like water at the bottom of a well. 7 days until the window she'd predicted. She had 7 days to decide what kind of person she was going to be on the other side of this. She spent the first 2 of those days doing something she hadn't done since arriving at the estate. She stopped being careful. She stopped managing her access, stopped staying inside the boundaries of what she'd been given, stopped treating Damien's trust like a resource she needed to conserve. She went into the network the way she went into problems she'd already decided to solve, completely, without hesitation, pulling everything she could reach. She found the full picture of the Renner operation on the second night. Vincent Renner was not an innocent man. She hadn't expected him to be. But the scope of what Damien had built around him, the patience of it, the architecture, was something she sat with for a long time in the dark of her room. Renner had been systematically destabilizing Damien's operation for 2 years. Not through direct confrontation, but through the same kind of long-game infrastructure assault she'd been hired to counter. Eroding supply lines, turning personnel, funding the rival faction that had planted the compromised server in Felix's basement. He was the origin point of almost every problem she'd been brought in to fix. That didn't make what was coming clean, but it made it something she could look at directly without flinching. On the 3rd day she went to Ethan. He was in his room, at the desk, staring at the wall. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it always did. The mixture of relief and guilt that she'd been reading since they were children. The expression of someone who needed forgiveness and knew they hadn't earned it. She sat on the edge of his bed. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him. "I'm not going to protect you this time," she said. His throat moved. "Not because I don't—" She stopped. Restarted. "I'm not doing it because it doesn't work. It has never worked. Every time I've absorbed something that belonged to you, it just made room for the next thing. Charlotte, I'm not finished." Her voice was even. She'd practiced this, not in words but in the space behind her sternum, the place where she'd been carrying his weight for so long it had its own shape. "You're going to face what you did. The debt, the running, the information you leaked to Renner's people." He went white. "How did you—" "Because I'm good at my job." She looked at him steadily. "You've been passing information to Renner's network. Small things, you probably told yourself. Manageable things. Things that didn't feel like betrayal because you were scared and you thought you were buying yourself safety." She paused. "How long?" He put his face in his hands. "Ethan, 2 months," he said, muffled. "Before I ran. They came to me. They said they knew about the debt. They said if I gave them information about Damien's operation, they'd clear what I owed. I thought I could—" "You thought you could play both sides." He didn't answer, which was an answer. Charlotte sat with that for a moment. The anger was there. It had always been there, under the exhaustion, under the love. But it had changed shape. It wasn't the hot anger of being hurt. It was something colder and more final. The anger of someone who has finished mourning something while it was still technically alive. "Damien knows," she said. Ethan looked up. "He's known for a while, I think. Long enough that whatever you gave them was factored into his planning." She stood up. "He's going to deal with it, and I'm not going to stop him." "Charlotte, I'll make sure you're not hurt," she said. "That's what I can give you. I'll make sure the outcome isn't physical. But beyond that—" She moved to the door. "You're on your own, Ethan. You have been for a long time. I just didn't admit it." She left before he could say anything else. She closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway and breathed through the tightness in her chest until it loosened enough to move. Then she went to find Damien. He was in his office. He looked up when she walked in and closed the door, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down what he was holding. "You know about Ethan," she said. "The information he passed." "Yes." "How long?" 3 weeks. Since she'd arrived. He'd known since she'd arrived, which meant he'd known when he gave her the Ethan is alive confirmation, which meant every calibration she'd done around her brother's safety had been based on information Damien had shaped. "Tell me what you're planning to do with him," she said. "He'll be removed from the organization's reach. Permanently. No violence, he's not worth the exposure, and his information was low-level enough that the damage is manageable. He paused. He'll be exiled. Financially cut off from any network connected to my operation. He'll have to build something from nothing. That's survivable, she said. Yes. Okay. She crossed her arms. Then we talk about the next 4 days. Damien looked at her. You're staying. I'm staying because walking out now means your operation runs without the one person who built its current defensive architecture and knows exactly where every vulnerability is. She held his gaze. Not because I've forgiven the way you brought me here. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Good. She moved to the chair across from his desk and sat down. Show me everything. The full Renner file, the attack timeline, the response plan, all of it. She put her hands flat on the desk. You wanted me in the room. I'm in the room. Don't waste it. He showed her everything. It took 4 hours. By the end of it, she understood the full shape of what was coming. Not just the network intrusion she'd been monitoring, but the physical component that Damien's intelligence suggested would accompany it. Renner's people weren't just going to probe the digital infrastructure. They were coming for the estate itself. The compromised server operation, which Charlotte had been running as a counterintelligence measure, had given them a false picture of Damien's defensive positioning, deliberately depleted on the east perimeter, apparently thin on personnel in the main building. They would believe they had a clean approach. They would be wrong. The trap was elegant. She almost admired it despite everything. They'll move on night 5, she said, looking at the timeline. Not night 4. 4 is too obvious. It lines up too cleanly with the window I projected. They'll think they're being clever by waiting 1 extra day. Damien looked at her analysis. You're sure? I've been watching their decision pattern for 3 weeks. They move when they think they have an information advantage. The extra day is them convincing themselves they've outthought us. She tapped the timeline. Night 5, 2 in the morning, east perimeter first, then the main building within 18 minutes. He was quiet for a moment, studying her work. I need you in the operations room when it starts, he said, monitoring the network in real time. If they bring technical support, jammers, anything that disrupts our communications, I can counter it, she said, if I know about it in advance. You'll know. Then we're set. She left his office at 11 that night and went to her room and slept for 6 hours, which was more sleep than she'd had in 4 days and less than she needed, but sufficient. She woke before her alarm, showered, made coffee in the kitchen alone in the early quiet, and stood at the window while the grounds came into focus in the morning light. Night 5 was 3 days away. She spent those 3 days in a state of controlled preparation that had its own particular quality. Not calm exactly, but focused, the way a lens focuses light into something that can burn. She hardened every layer of the network she could reach. She built redundancies into the communication systems. She mapped the east perimeter's surveillance gaps and patched 2 of them without being asked. She ran 3 simulations of the attack scenario and found one critical flaw in the defensive positioning that Damien's security chief, a man named Carver, who was competent and experienced and not particularly interested in input from a 23-year-old woman, initially dismissed. She put the flaw in writing and left it on Damien's desk. By the following morning, the defensive positioning had been adjusted. Carver said nothing about it. Neither did she. On the day before night 5, she went to Ethan one final time. He already knew something was coming. The estate had a particular tension in it, the kind that moved through buildings the way weather moved through open country, felt before it was visible. He was standing when she came in, which told her his anxiety had been running too high to sit. Whatever happens tonight, she said, stay in this room. Don't open the door for anyone except Marcus. Don't try to help. Don't try to run. She looked at him. Just stay. Charlotte, what's... Just stay, she said again. She left him there. Night 5 arrived the way bad things arrived, quietly at first. The silence before it having a texture that was different from ordinary silence, loaded with the specific weight of things about to happen. Charlotte was in the operations room at 1 in the morning, 90 minutes early, with 3 screens running and her coffee going cold at her elbow. The operations room was in the center of the main building. No exterior windows, reinforced door, Carver's design, and it was good design. She had full visibility into every camera feed on the estate, every network node, every communication channel. Damien came in at 1:30. He stood behind her for a moment, looking at the screens, and she could feel the particular quality of his presence in the room. The density of it, the focused stillness. "Network's clean," she said. "They haven't started jamming yet. When they do, I'll see it here first." She tapped the left screen. "I've got a tripwire on their command channel, the one they think we don't know about. First sign of activation, I'll have approximately 4 minutes warning. 4 minutes is enough." "It'll have to be." He moved to the other side of the room. Carver was there with 2 other people she'd learned to recognize over the weeks. Operational staff, calm, and prepared with the specific quality of people who had done this before. Radios. Weapons she didn't look at directly. At 1:47 the tripwire fired. "They're moving," Charlotte said. Her voice came out flat and clean. "East perimeter. I'm seeing signal interference beginning. They've got a portable jammer, low frequency. It's going to hit the exterior cameras in about 90 seconds. Her fingers were already moving. "Rerouting camera feeds through the secondary channel. Hold on." The east perimeter cameras flickered. 2 went dark. 3 rerouted successfully and came back online through the channel she'd built 2 days ago specifically for this. "I've got eyes on east perimeter," she said. 7 individuals. Moving fast, tactical formation. They think the cameras are down. Carver spoke into his radio. His voice was very even. "Main building approach," Charlotte said. "They've split. 4 east, 3 moving to circle north. They're going for the side entrance." She pulled up the north camera. "I see them." The next 12 minutes were the most concentrated of her life. She tracked 7 people moving through the dark exterior of the estate with the systematic focus of someone reading a network intrusion, pattern recognition, anticipation, responding to movement before it fully developed. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't shake. She called positions and redirected camera feeds, encountered 2 additional jamming attempts with the countermeasures she'd built. And when the east perimeter breach happened, she had Carver's team positioned and waiting before the first figure cleared the wall. The sound of it reached her through the building's walls. Not clearly, not cinematically, but as a series of impacts and shouted commands, compressed and indistinct, the way conflict sounded from inside a concrete room. She kept her eyes on the screens. The north group reached the side entrance. She watched them work the lock. They were fast, professional. And she watched the door open and she said, "North entrance, they're in." And Carver's radio crackled with acknowledgement and she heard movement in the hallway outside the operations room. Then the lights went out. Full blackout, not the camera feeds. Those were on a separate power source, her design. But the building's main lighting, which meant they'd hit the external power supply. Red emergency lighting kicked in. She could still see her screens. "Generators online," she said, to no one in particular, to the room, to herself. "Main network is stable. I've still got eyes." She had eyes on 8 of the 12 cameras. The other 4 had been physically disabled. Not remotely, physically, which meant someone had reached them, which meant the perimeter had been breached more thoroughly than the first wave had suggested. "Carver," she said. "Second wave. They sent a second wave while we were watching the first." Carver's radio was either jammed or he was somewhere the signal didn't reach. She was effectively alone in the room. She looked at the screens. She did the math with the cold precision that had become her primary mode of operation over the last several days. 8 cameras. The second wave, she could see them now on camera 4, 3 individuals moving through the east corridor, which was 30 meters from the operations room. She picked up the radio on the table beside her. Damien's, left when he'd gone to the east perimeter with Carver 10 minutes ago. She tried 3 frequencies. The third one crackled. "Charlotte," Damien's voice. Strained, close to the receiver, background noise that she identified as shouting. "Second wave in the east corridor," she said. 30 meters from operations. Carver's radio is down. Where are you?" "East perimeter. We're..." A sound she didn't identify. "We're contained here. How many in the corridor?" 3. Moving fast. She watched them on camera 4. 20 meters. "Lock the operations room door and don't..." The operations room door opened. Not from the inside. The man who came through it was not one of Carver's people. He was large and wearing tactical gear, and he swept the room with the trained efficiency of someone who'd been told to clear it, and was doing so. And when his eyes found her at the screens, he pointed the weapon at her chest and said, "Step away from the console." Charlotte's hands went up. Her mind was running very fast. She was 23 years old with no combat training and a coffee cup and the radio in her left hand that was still connected to Damien, and the man 3 meters from her was waiting for her to move away from the console she'd spent 3 days building. The console that was currently the only set of eyes on what was happening inside and outside the estate. She stepped away from the console. The man moved towards it. He pulled something from his vest, a device she recognized after a half-second delay, a hardware kill switch, the kind used to physically destroy network equipment. Fast, irreversible. If he deployed it, she lost all camera feeds, all communication channels, everything she'd built. She had approximately 4 seconds. She threw the coffee cup. It was a terrible weapon and she knew it, and she threw it anyway, not to hit him. She didn't aim for his head or his hands. She aimed for the console itself, because the sound of the cup hitting the console made him flinch and half-turn, and that half-turn was 2 seconds, and 2 seconds was enough. She hit the emergency lockdown sequence she'd built into the console 2 days ago. It wasn't on any diagram. She'd added it herself, and she hadn't told anyone about it because she'd learned in the last 3 weeks to always build something that was hers alone. Every external access point on the network locked simultaneously. Every camera feed compressed and backed up to an off-site server. Every communication channel rerouted through a channel that would take specialized equipment to jam, and that Renner's people had never known existed. The man grabbed her by the arm. The pain was immediate and specific. His grip was not gentle, and she was pulled away from the console, and her back hit the wall, and she heard the radio hit the floor and skitter somewhere under the table. He was still holding her when the operations room door opened again. Damien came through it moving fast, faster than she'd ever seen him move, and what happened next was brief and entirely one-sided. And she looked away from the specifics of it because there were things she'd decided she didn't need to witness to understand. When she looked back, the man was on the floor and Damien was standing over him breathing hard, his jacket gone, his white shirt dark on the left side in a way that wasn't sweat. She stared at the dark stain. "You're shot," she said, grazed. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something she could hear in the breath beneath it. "The lockdown, already done. Feeds are backed up, channels are secured." She crossed the room to him. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding through your shirt." "Charlotte." "Sit down," she said. "The fighting is outside. Carver has what he needs. Sit down." He sat. Not because she told him to, she understood that, but because his body had made a decision that superseded his preference. He sat against the wall of the operations room with his hand pressed to his left side, and she crouched in front of him and pushed his hand aside to look at it with the same focused attention she'd given every problem in this building. The wound was real, but survivable. Deep graze along the ribs, bleeding steadily, not arterial. "I need something to press against this," she said. He reached into his jacket, which was on the floor beside him, and produced a folded cloth with the resigned efficiency of someone who had needed this before and planned for it. She pressed it against the wound. He made a sound that was almost not a sound, compressed, controlled, swallowed almost completely. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't pretend it doesn't hurt. I can see it." He looked at her. His face was very close. Crouched in front of him, the distance between them was almost nothing. And in the red emergency lighting, his eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them, the cold blue stripped to something more fundamental. "The lockdown you built," he said. "The off-site backup. You didn't tell me about that." "No." "Why?" She kept pressure on the wound. Outside, distantly, the sounds of the conflict were shifting, less chaotic, more controlled. Carver's people gaining ground. "Because I needed something that was mine," she said, "that you couldn't see and couldn't plan around. Something I hadn't been engineered into building." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you stayed? To build something you owned?" She looked at him. At the blood on his shirt and the steadiness of his hands, and the particular quality of his attention, which had never once in 3 weeks made her feel like a variable, even when she knew that was exactly what she'd been at the start. "I stayed," she said, "because leaving meant the clock I'd wound kept running without my hand on it. And I don't build things I'm not willing to be responsible for." Something moved through his face. Not the calculation, not the assessment. Something that had been there, she understood now, for longer than she'd let herself see. "Charlotte," he said. "Don't," she said, and her voice had a roughness in it she hadn't intended. "Not right now. Not while you're bleeding in an emergency-lit room." His mouth almost moved toward something. The radio crackled from under the table. Carver's voice, clear and operational. "East perimeter secure. North entrance clear. 2 contacts detained, rest scattered. Mr. Moretti." A pause. "It's done." Charlotte sat back on her heels. She kept her hand on the wound because the wound was still real and still bleeding, and the fact that the fighting was over didn't change the physics of it. Damien's head dropped back against the wall. Outside, somewhere in the building, a door opened, and then another. And then she heard Marcus's voice calling names and getting answers. The systematic human accounting that happened after violence. The counting of who remained. She thought about Ethan in his room. She thought about the lockdown she'd built in 2 days' work that had just saved everything. She thought about the man on the floor in Damien's face when he'd come through the door and the specific quality of the speed with which he'd moved when he'd understood she was in danger. Some things, she was beginning to understand, could not be engineered. Some things happened in the space between calculation and decision, in the gap where a person moved faster than their own planning and showed you, without meaning to, exactly what they were willing to pay for. She looked at Damien against the wall with his eyes half closed and his breathing measured and the cloth pressed to his ribs. And she understood with the clarity of someone who had finally stopped arguing with their own evidence that the question was no longer whether to trust him. The question was what they were going to build. The question was what they were going to build together. But that question belonged to a different morning than this one. This morning still had blood in it. Marcus arrived at the operations room 11 minutes after Carver's radio confirmation, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had performed post-incident triage before and understood the hierarchy of it. People first, then systems, then the accounting. He took one look at Damien against the wall and at Charlotte's hand still pressed to his ribs, and he pulled his radio without a word and called for the estate's medical staff in the tone of someone who was not panicking but was not wasting time either. Damien tried to stand up. "Stay down," Charlotte said. "The estate needs—" "Carver has the estate. Stay down." He looked at her. She looked back. The particular quality of the standoff lasted about 4 seconds before something in him made a pragmatic decision, and he stayed where he was, which she understood was not compliance but calculation. He was conserving energy for things that required it, and arguing with her in an emergency-lit room while bleeding was not one of those things. The medical staff came. Charlotte moved back and let them work, standing against the far wall with her arms crossed, and the specific exhaustion that hit after adrenaline finished its business. Not sleepiness, but a hollowing out, a sudden awareness of every muscle she'd tensed in the last 2 hours. Her shoulder ached where she'd hit the wall. Her right hand had a cut across 2 knuckles from somewhere she couldn't identify, and she was looking at it with mild detachment when Marcus appeared beside her. "The man who came through the door," she said. "Detained," Marcus said, along with one other. "The rest withdrew when the east perimeter collapsed." He paused. "You locked the network." "Yes." "Off-site backup." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the steady expression of someone reassessing a thing they thought they'd already fully assessed. "You built that yourself. 2 days ago. Did you tell Mr. Moretti?" "No." Marcus absorbed this. He didn't ask why, which meant he either understood already or had decided the answer was self-evident. "The backup saved the evidence chain," he said. "Everything Renner's people accessed, everything they attempted, it's all preserved. Carver can use it." That was the intention. He nodded. Then, after a pause that had a specific quality to it, not awkward, but weighted. "You did well tonight, Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. Marcus was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not a man who gave unnecessary reassurance. The statement landed with the particular weight of something that had been considered before it was offered. "Charlotte," she said. He almost smiled. "Charlotte." Damien was on his feet by the time the medical staff finished with him, stitched, wrapped, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a real wound with real pain, while refusing to let either of those things show in his face. He found her in the hallway outside the operations room, and he looked at her hand. "You're cut," he said. "I noticed." "Come here." She let the medical staff bandage her hand because refusing was pointless and the cut was real, and she sat on a chair in the hallway of her own will and watched Damien lean against the opposite wall watching her while it was done. His face in the normal lighting, the emergency red had been replaced by the estate's generator power, a warmer and more honest light, was tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not weakened, just honest. The layers he maintained with such discipline had been thinned by blood loss and the specific aftermath of violence, and what was visible underneath was something closer to the actual man than anything she'd been shown across a desk or through a window. When the medical staff left, she stood up. Ethan, she said. He's fine. Marcus checked. I want to see him. Damien nodded. He didn't offer to come with her, which was the right instinct. Ethan was sitting on his bed exactly where she'd left him, or he'd been pacing and had sat down when he heard footsteps, which was more likely given the state of his expression. He looked at her bandaged hand and at the state of her generally, and his face went through several things quickly. You're okay, he said. Yes. I heard. Through the walls, I heard. It's over. She sat in the chair by his desk, which was the chair she always took in his room, and she looked at him for a long moment. Damien is dealing with Renner. It's done. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. He looked like someone who had spent several hours alone with the full weight of his own choices and no comfortable way to put them down. Good, Charlotte thought, and the thought didn't feel cruel. It felt accurate. I need to say something, he said. You don't have to. I do. He dropped his hands. His eyes were red at the edges. Charlotte, I have spent 15 years making messes and leaving them in your direction. Mom's money, the Vegas thing, every time. And I knew I was doing it. I knew it wasn't. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd fix it. I told myself you were strong enough that it wasn't really hurting you. He stopped. That was a lie I told myself because the truth was that I was scared and weak, and you were the only person who never left. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. Not the way I've said it before. Not the version where I mean it for 3 weeks and then do the next thing. He met her eyes. I mean the version where I finally understand that sorry without change is just noise. The room was quiet. I know, she said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. She nodded. Once. Damien is going to exile you from the network, she said. You won't have access to any financial system or contact connected to his operation. You're going to have to start from nothing somewhere. She paused. I won't help you this time. His jaw tightened. Not in protest, in acceptance, which looked the same but felt entirely different. I know, he said. I mean it. I know, Charlotte. She stood up. She went to the door. Then she stopped, because there was one more thing, and she'd decided she was going to say it, even though it would cost her something. I love you, she said, without turning around. That hasn't changed. It's not going to change. She put her hand on the doorframe. But love isn't the same as rescue. I should have understood that a long time ago. She left before he could respond. The estate spent the next several days in the specific mode that followed violence. Not recovery exactly, more like recalibration, the way a body adjusts after a fever breaks. Carver's people cleared and documented and filed. Felix, subdued in a way that suited him better than his previous confidence, worked alongside Charlotte to remove the compromised server and audit every connection it had touched. The east perimeter was repaired. The north entrance door was replaced with something heavier. Renner was dealt with in ways that Charlotte was told about in outline and chose not to examine in detail. She understood enough to understand that the threat was over. She understood enough to understand that the manner of its ending was the kind of thing that lived in the space she'd decided to leave to Damien's operational judgment, because she had her own work and her own line, and she'd located that line with more precision in the last 2 weeks than she'd managed in the preceding 3. Ethan left on the 4th day after the attack. She watched from her window, not the east wing window of her room, the hallway window on the ground floor that looked out over the front drive. Marcus put him in a car with a bag and an envelope that she'd been told contained enough to get him started somewhere, which was more than she would have offered, and which she understood was Damien's specific calibration of justice, which was not the same as mercy, but adjacent to it. Ethan looked up at the building before he got in the car. She didn't know if he could see her. She didn't move away from the window. The car went down the driveway and into the trees. She stood at the window for a while after. The grief was real. She didn't try to manage it or compress it into something more efficient. She let it be what it was. The grief of someone who had finally stopped carrying a weight they'd mistaken for love, which didn't make the putting down of it painless. It made it necessary. She went back to work. 2 weeks after the attack, on a morning in early November when the grounds outside were pale with the first frost, and the light came through the windows at the low angle of a season shifting, Damien asked her to come to his office. She'd been in his office dozens of times. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk with the ease of someone who had stopped needing to prepare herself for the space. And she looked at him and registered, for the first time without the interference of crisis or conflict. How different he was from the man who had appeared at her door in the rain. Not different, in fact. Different in her understanding of him. The same man, seen more completely. He had a folder on his desk. He pushed it across to her. She opened it. Legal documents. Her name at the top. She read the first page with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and by the second paragraph she understood what she was holding. Release documentation. Full and legal. Her freedom from any obligation to the organization, the estate, the operation. The suspension of Ethan's debt, not collection deferred, genuinely suspended, restructured into a civil matter with no criminal exposure and a repayment schedule so modest it was effectively symbolic. Her personal accounts, her professional credentials, her reputation, everything intact, everything returned. She could walk out the front door today and nothing would follow her. She read the documents twice. Then she set them on the desk and looked at him. "Why?" she said. I was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the operations room, without the architecture of professionalism between them, without the measured distance, just directly. "Because what I did to bring you here was wrong," he said. "I knew it when I did it. I had justifications that were real. You were genuinely needed, the operation was genuinely at risk. But I used your brother's disaster as a lever, and I used it deliberately, and I have understood for several weeks that you deserve to have the choice I took from you given back." She looked at the documents. "It doesn't undo it," he said. "I'm not offering this because I think it balances the account. There's no balancing it." He paused. "I'm offering it because you've earned the right to choose. Actually choose." The office was very quiet. Outside, the frost-pale grounds caught the low November light and held it. Charlotte thought about the night she'd packed 2 bags in 40 minutes. She thought about sitting on her kitchen floor reading Ethan's goodbye messages. She thought about the flickering overhead light and the packing tape on the window and the eviction notice she'd taped to the inside of the cabinet because she couldn't stand to see it every day. She thought about the last 2 months, about Felix and his undocumented servers, and the way his defensive posture had collapsed into something honest when she found the intrusion. About Carver adjusting his positioning without acknowledgement after reading her written assessment. About Marcus calling her Charlotte. About the off-site backup she'd built in 2 days because she needed one thing that was entirely hers. About a man moving faster than his own planning across an emergency-lit room. She thought about what it meant to choose something. Not to accept the least bad option. Not to make the decision that absorbed the most damage. To actually choose, with full information and full sight of the cost and the shape of the thing you were choosing. She picked up the documents. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she tore them. Not in half, not dramatically. She tore them once, twice, a third time, into pieces that couldn't be reassembled into something binding. And she set them on his desk in a small pile. And she looked at Damien Moretti across the desk and said nothing for a moment because some things required the silence before words. His face did not perform relief. It did not perform surprise. It looked the way it looked when he was receiving information he'd hoped for but hadn't let himself count on. Carefully still, holding the thing at a slight distance while determining whether it was real. "I'm not staying because of the debt," she said. "I know. I'm not staying because I don't have somewhere else to go. I have somewhere else to go. I could rebuild a freelance practice in 4 months. I could probably land a corporate role in 6. She kept her voice even. "I have options." "I know that too. I'm staying because this work is real," she said. "Because I'm better here than I've been anywhere else, at anything else. And I'm done being paid below my value by people who don't understand what they have." She paused. "And because the things I've been not examining for the last 2 months are things I've decided to examine." Damien was very still. "You were wrong about how you brought me here," she said. "That's documented. I'm not erasing it. I'm not asking you to. But you were not wrong about what you saw." She held his gaze. "I don't forgive easily. I don't forget at all. You're going to have to operate with someone who will call out every mistake, who will not smooth things over to make the relationship comfortable, who will build things you don't know about because she needs to know she has something that's hers." She tilted her head slightly. "Can you work with that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Then you do more than work with it." The question sat between them. It was the most direct she'd been. About this. About the specific thing that had been building in the spaces between every other thing for 2 months. And she watched him receive it. "Yes," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he was saying something irrevocable. Not performed certainty. Actual certainty, the kind that came from a person who did not say things lightly or walk them back. She nodded. She stood up. She moved to the window. His window, the one that looked out over the estate with the low November light falling across the grounds. And she stood there for a moment looking at the shape of it. The geometric garden, the perimeter she'd learned by camera feed and now knew well enough to walk in the dark. The tree line at the edge of the property where the driveway disappeared. Damien came to stand beside her, not close enough to demand anything. Just present. Beside her in the same light, looking at the same grounds, the distance between them. The particular distance of two people who have stopped managing it. There's something I haven't asked you, she said. Ask. The night you came to my apartment, the first night. She looked at the frost on the garden. Was any of it real? The offer you made, work for me, the debt suspends, your brother lives. Was that the offer you were always going to make, or did you have a harder version you put away when you met me? Silence. I had a harder version, he said. What was it? It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. I was quiet for a moment. The harder version didn't survive meeting you, he said. That's not a comfortable thing to admit. I walked into your apartment with a plan, and I walked out with a different one. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the grounds, not at her, which was its own kind of honesty, the kind that didn't perform itself. What changed it, she said. You opened the door, he said. Most people don't open the door. She thought about that. About standing in her kitchen with the eviction notice and the 3 laptops and the sound of knocking that wasn't asking permission, and making the calculation that the door was going to be a problem regardless, and it was better to face problems than to stand behind them. That's a low bar, she said. It's a revealing one. She looked back at the grounds. The frost was melting in the morning light, slowly, in patches, the cold giving way to the warmth of a sun that didn't care what had happened in this building 2 weeks ago. I need something from you, she said. Name it. No more managed information. No more giving me the picture you've decided I'm ready for. She turned to face him fully. I work best with complete data. You know that. You've watched me work for 2 months, and you know that half information is where mistakes live. She held his gaze. Everything, from now on. His jaw moved slightly. Not resistance, consideration. The serious, genuine consideration of someone deciding whether a thing was possible, not whether it was palatable. There are operational details that carry exposure for people who know them, he said, not withheld from you specifically, withheld from everyone outside the core. Then I'm in the core, or I'm not making the offer. He looked at her. She looked back. Yes, he said. That was faster than I expected. I decided something the night of the attack. What? That the most dangerous thing in this building isn't the network or the perimeter or the enemies outside it, he said. It's having someone with your capability operating without full context. He paused. Which is a self-interested reason to agree with you, but it's also true. She almost smiled. I'll take self-interested and true over generous and false. I know, he said. That's one of the things I knew before you got here. The morning settled around them. Outside, one of Carver's people was doing a perimeter walk. She could see him moving at the edge of the garden, his breath visible in the cold air, methodical and unhurried. The estate in the aftermath of everything had a quality she hadn't felt in it before. Not peaceful exactly. Something more earned than peaceful. The quiet of a thing that had been tested and had not broken. She thought about her mother. She thought about her specifically in the way she thought about her when she wanted to be honest with herself. Not the softened memory, but the clear one. The woman who had worked double shifts and paid debts that weren't hers, and opened her door to a man on the porch, and handled it with a composure that Charlotte had spent years trying to understand. She understood it now. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't martyrdom. It was the composure of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had decided it was worth doing, on her own terms, with her eyes open. Charlotte was not her mother. She was not making the same choices or paying the same costs. But she understood, standing at this window in this light, that the composure was inheritable. Not the specific sacrifice, but the quality of choosing consciously, of standing in a hard place and saying, this is what I'm doing, and meaning it all the way down. She was not the woman who had sat on a kitchen floor reading goodbye messages. She was not the woman who had spent years absorbing consequences that belonged to someone else, calling it love, calling it necessary, calling it anything except what it was. Fear of the empty space that would remain if she stopped. The empty space had turned out to be where she lived. She'd filled it herself. I'm going back to work, she said. Damien turned from the window. The Renner network still has 3 active nodes I haven't been able to trace. I know, I found 2 of them yesterday. She moved toward the door. I'm working on the 3rd. Of course you are. She stopped at the door, looked back at him, at the window light and the folder with its torn contents still on his desk, and the man standing in his own office like someone who had just received something he'd planned for and still been surprised by. Damien, she said. He looked at her. The document you gave me, she said. The release. How long did it take you to prepare it? A pause. 3 weeks. Since she'd arrived. He'd started preparing her freedom on the same day he'd taken it. She held that for a moment. It didn't clean anything. It didn't make the architecture of what he'd done into something other than what it was. But it was true. And it was the kind of true that added to a picture rather than completing it, the way most real things did. She left him in his office and walked down the hallway toward the server room, where Felix was already at his station, and the 3rd active node was waiting to be found. And the work was real, and the stakes were real, and the life she was living in this building was not the life she'd planned, but was entirely, unmistakably, irreversibly hers. She was 23 years old. She was not surviving anymore. She had stopped surviving somewhere in the last 2 months. In the operations room or the kitchen confrontation, or the moment she'd torn paper into pieces that couldn't be put back together. And what she was doing now had a different name. A name that didn't require the management of damage or the conservation of the self against the next incoming thing. She walked into the server room and sat at her station and opened her monitoring dashboard and found the 3rd node in 40 minutes because she was very good at her job and getting better. And when she sent the location to Damien's secure channel, she did it without ceremony, the way you did things that had become natural, that had become the texture of a life rather than a performance inside one. His response came back in under a minute. 2 words, good work. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the message and went back to work, and the server room hummed around her, and outside the November morning continued its slow warming, and somewhere in the building the man who had arrived to collect a debt was learning, slowly, what it meant to have received something he had no framework for keeping, and the woman who had packed 2 bags in 40 minutes and told herself she was walking into a prison had stopped being surprised, somewhere along the way, that what she'd walked into instead was the first place in her life where the ceiling was entirely out of sight.